Okay.
No, that's what you did.
All right. So my plan is I want to finish up the chapter tomorrow, and then the next time you guys meet with me, we'll do a review again, and then Friday we'll test. All right. And then you guys know you guys are at home when you're taking that test, so you can use your notes, right? Now, if you don't get done within that hour, you can turn it into me later. So you don't have to have it done within that hour. I give you that option to turn it in later, if you're, So chances are you should get a good grade on this, right? You know what I'm saying? People do fail my class, though, believe it or not. How? I have no idea, but they do. All right, so this was the last slide on Friday. Don't type this out because you already typed it out. So on Friday, just to kind of recap, because you guys had a weekend of, I don't know, sniffing glue or whatever you guys do. It's not, who am I to judge? All right. But you probably weren't thinking about what we were talking about on Friday over the weekend, which is understandable. All right, because you guys are huffing paint. So the deal here is that we were talking about the kind of expansion of the religion outside of the Arabian Peninsula. And the first kind of great era of expansion, historians like to kind of give the eras 632 to 732. Now, those two dates are significant because 632 marks the death of the Prophet Muhammad. 732 marks a battle called the Battle of Tours, which I'll talk about again in chapter 9 when we talk about the Franks. Basically halted Muslim advancement into Western Europe. Mainly it was between the Franks, who were primarily Christians, with the kind of the Moors from Spain. Right, the Muslims from Spain there. So the deal is, though, that, again, the Prophet Muhammad is not just a religious figure, but he's a political and military figure as well. All right, after he dies, he has kind of established an empire. Usually with empires, right, you usually kind of like pass down your kind of like power from father to son. Like most of these societies, they're patriarchal, all right. The Prophet doesn't have any sons. He has a number of daughters, but no sons. So this is where the kind of the leadership from the get-go, from the jump, is somewhat disputed. Do you remember what they referred to those people that were the successors to the Prophet? They're called caliphs, right? And they were establishing a caliphate, right? And so the first four, the Rashun, the righteously guided ones, the Orthodox caliphate, the first one that succeeded the Prophet Muhammad was Abu Bakr. He was one of the early kind of converts to Islam. He was essentially the Prophet's neighbor, all right? He's the one who ordered the compiling of the Quran, all right? And then he is succeeded by Omar, who's the great conqueror. He conquered places like Egypt, Mesopotamia, Jerusalem, stuff like that. Uthman is basically kind of his connection to Omar basically gave him the kind of caliphate. And then the fourth one, that's where we got some issues here. That's Ali. All right. Now, Ali is unique because Ali is actually related to the Prophet. He's a blood relation. He's a cousin. He's also married to one of the Prophet's daughters. All right. So that article I sent you guys out yesterday, kind of talking about, which is the main kind of split within the Islamic world today between Sunnis and Shias. Which of the two believes that the rightful leadership of the kind of the Islamic world should be a blood relation to the Prophet Muhammad? Sunni or Shia?
Sunni.
No, Shia. Good guess, though. All right, it was 50-50, right?
50-50.
All right. So the Shia or the Shiites essentially claim that you have to be a blood relation to the Prophet Muhammad. Sunnis are the ones who are like Abu Bakr and Omar, who essentially it's mainly just basically the teachings of the Quran and that it is irrelevant in whether the blood relation is there. All right. Then we talked about that incident where Ali has a son after he was killed. Ali's son Hussein basically tries to claim his rightful leadership. He is defeated at the Battle of Karbala. He's martyred. We talked about that they commemorate that with that thing called the Shura. All right. And from there on, that's where the trajectory kind of exists. All right. Before the death of Hussein, the establishment of what they call the first Muslim dynasty, where we see passage from father to son, established by a guy named Muawiyah, were the Umayyads, who basically moved the political center and kind of away from Arabia to Damascus, the oldest city that's kind of been continuously inhabited. All right. After the Umayyads, then the Abbasids. What city did the Abbasids create as their capital that became the kind of center of the Islamic world? It's the capital of the modern-day country of Iraq. Here's a hint. It's a one word, 2 syllables. The first syllable, the first part of the word, you carry stuff with it. We put things in it. Baghdad, good. Okay. All right, Baghdad. All right. And so Baghdad became the center there. During the reign of Harun al-Rashid, all right, that's the peak of the Islamic kind of civil, what they call the golden age of Islamic culture. All right. And so he was the obviously caliphate during the late period of 700s and the 800s, 8th and 9th century, if you will. All right. At one point, they believe he may have been the richest man in the world. He is also credited with having the kind of the Arabian Nights, the kind of 1,000 night stories of Aladdin and Sinbad, all compiled into an actual book rather than kind of oral traditions, if you will. All right. But after Harun al-Rashid, we start to see, historians look back and start to see a decline, a lot of infighting within the Abbasid Caliphate, and the emergence of like these political centers where they break off from the Abbasids while still recognizing the Abbasid Caliphate as a religious kind of figure here. One of the first places is down in Egypt, in North Africa. All right, one of the first groups to kind of break from the Abbasids are a kind of dynasty referred to as the Fatimids. Now, the Fatimids are a little different. They're Shiites. They're Ismaili Shiites. All right, and there's different types of kind of Shiite sects. All right, the majority of Shiites today are what we call Twelvers, who believe in there's these 12 righteously kind of imams. We've had 11 so far. The 12th one, the Mahdi, has yet to return. He's like in hiding. When he emerges, he's going to show up with Jesus, and that's the end of the days, end of the world, right? So they take their name from Fatima, who was the Prophet Muhammad's daughter, who was married to Ali, the mother of Hussein there, all right? They actually have their origins in what is probably Algeria, all right? And they established the city of Cairo as their capital, which is now the modern-day capital of Egypt, if you will. Now, the Fatimids were ruling over a majority Sunni population, but even Christians and Jews, like in Alexandria, there was still a sizable population there. So they were relatively pretty liberal in that sense. But their significance, they were the first ones to essentially kind of break off from the Abbasids. All right, this is essentially the area that they're controlling politically and militarily. It includes the 3 holy cities at one point: Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. Right, and then this is the Al-Hazan Mosque, which was built by the 4th Caliph of the Fatimids. Right, so they ruled in Egypt primarily a little shy of 200 years. All right, then a little bit closer to the Abbasid heartland is another Shiite dynasty that takes over Baghdad in 945, called the Buyids. They're Persians. Right, they have their origins in what is now modern day Iran. They were Zoroastrians who converted to Islam, to Shia Islam. All right, they are what we classify as Twelvers. All right, they are going to lay the foundation for, if we get to chapter 15, a dynasty called the Safavids, all right, which is another golden age of Islamic history. The Iranian government today kind of traces their kind of origins to the Safavids. All right, and so the Buyids are again, they're good. The Abbasid Caliph is still kind of there, but it's kind of more of a figurehead. All right, they're primarily controlling areas that includes like essentially Iraq and Iran, kind of western part of Iran. All right, and so they're there for about roughly 200 years or so, and then the Abbasids are going to turn to a group of people that migrated into Abbasid territory, kind of right around the Golden Age, called the Turks. All right. Now the Turks are these various tribes and clans that kind of made up with kind of Central Asia, right? Like a lot of the stands today, like Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, in that area there. All right. Now, the Abbasids essentially used them as auxiliary forces, much like how the Romans did with groups like the Goths and the Franks. All right. And so eventually the Turks are going to convert to Islam. All right. They're going to be Sunni. All right. Sunni Muslims. And so the Abbasids are going to use them as a counterweight against the Buyids. All right. And so at one point here, they're going to overthrow the Buyids. All right. And so the first of the Turks to migrate into Abbasid territory are referred to as the Seljuks. Now, the Seljuks are led by a guy named Taghril Beg. Right? And Beg is going to defeat the Buyids, kick them out of Baghdad, and still keep the Abbasid Caliphate kind of like in power there. But it's unspoken that basically the political and military leadership rests with the Seljuks. We'll talk about the Seljuks again when we get to chapter 9. They are going to basically be in control of the Holy Land, Jerusalem, at the time of the First Crusade. All right, they're going to be the ones main in power. They're going to lay the foundation for another group of Turks called the Ottomans, who are going to take over much of the Islamic world up until the beginning of the 20th century. All right, you guys probably talked about World War I, the Ottoman Empire and stuff. All right, so Taghril Beg has a sweet mustache. All right, that's mainly what I just want to talk about is his mustache. All right, like usually, like I mean, like if you just kind of twirl it there, it's glorious. All right. Like, since the worst thing about COVID is that you can't rock a mustache. Like, people won't appreciate a mustache like Taghril Beg's. All right. Now the Seljuks, while they kind of like, Baghdad was basically the domain of the Abbasid Caliph. They were mainly based out of Ray in what is now modern day Iran. And so this is Taghril Beg's tomb. It's basically kind of a conical kind of tomb. It's like Kokia. It's a kind of United Nations World Heritage Site. The Turks are going to bring into the lexicon of the Islamic world a term that is used today to signify anybody who is of wealth, standing, kind of like a noble. And that's the term sultan. This is generally the term Turkic groups when you refer to like chieftains. All right. In chapter 8, we're going to talk about a group of people called the Ghaznavids, who were a Turkic kind of Islamic state that was mainly based out of Afghanistan. All right. A guy named Mahmud of Ghaznavid was the first one to really take the title Sultan to mean like emperor in a sense. All right. So like I said, the Abbasid Caliphate is still operating as the de facto religious leader. All right. It's the Seljuks in this area that are kind of dominating the political and military. Seljuks are controlling. All right. There's a couple like here's Ray, the kind of capital, the Seljuk capital. Up here, this is 1040s, the Battle of Danquan, which is essentially a battle between the Seljuks and the Ghaznavids, who are both Muslims. 1071, right up here, is significant because this is a battle called the Battle of Manzikert. All right, the Battle of Manzikert was fought between the Seljuks and the Byzantine, the Eastern Roman Empire. All right, within 2 years here after the Battle of Manzikert, basically the Seljuks take control all of Asia Minor. All right, essentially what is Turkey, where the name gets it from. All right, Turkey, right? The Turks, Turkey. Okay. The Byzantine Emperor Romanov IV is going to be taken captive as well. Now, this battle is significant in the larger story because this is going to lay the foundation for the Crusades. All right, it's obvious after the Battle of Manzikert that the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, cannot protect Christendom from kind of the emerging kind of Muslim kind of like expansion. All right, so a guy named Pope Urban II in the 1090s calls for a crusade to basically free the Holy Land from what they refer to as Saracens. Saracens becomes a catch-all term for Muslims in the area, but Saracens were a specific tribe within the kind of like it was mainly in like Jordan and Syria in that area. All right, so the image here, and I will tell you, so we'll talk about this again when we talk about the Crusades. This is an image kind of painted or drawn from a European perspective, showing the Sultan, Alp Arslan, who was the nephew of Taghril Beg. Taghril didn't have a son, so he passed on his sultanship to his brother, who then passed it on to his son, subjugating Romanov IV, who is the Byzantine emperor. So remember I was telling you guys, like in the Islamic world, the Arab world, when you show somebody the sole of your shoe, you're basically kind of insulting them, right? All right, that's like, so what he's doing here is Alp Arslan is basically subjugating the emperor. He's got him pinned down with his foot. All right, it's obvious who is in power here. All right, but also too, the idea of like showing you the sole of your foot is basically here's a middle finger to you. All right, this is drawn from a European perspective because Alp Arslan is portrayed as like kind of a European king. The person that's drawing this has never been to this area. All right, so he's basically just like kind of drawing from what he knows. Now, what ends up happening is the Byzantines have to basically pay a ransom to get Romanov IV back, which I don't know why they did, because he went back to Constantinople and they said, you're no longer emperor. You've been gone for a few years. And to add insult to injury, we're going to blind you. All right, so it was a little harsh there, to say the least. But this is going to lay the foundation for the Crusades. All right, and so while the Seljuks are going to be in power, and then after the First Crusade, the Crusaders take over much of the Holy Land, all right, and the Seljuks kind of lose control politically of that area there. While in the meantime, the Fatimids lose control of essentially Egypt, and they are replaced by a Sunni dynasty called the Ayyubids. Now, the Ayyubids were essentially a Kurdish Arab dynasty. The founder of the Ayyubid dynasty was a guy named Saladin. Saladin was born in Tikrit, which is modern-day Iraq, which is also the birthplace of Saddam Hussein much, much later. All right, and so the Ayyubids are going to take back Jerusalem during the Second and Third Crusades. Normally, if we didn't have COVID, we would watch the movie Kingdom of Heaven, and they would talk about the Third Crusade, essentially. Saladin is going to take on mainly Richard the Lionheart in that crusade. All right, we'll talk about that in more detail. But essentially, the Ayyubids essentially basically win back the Holy Land at that point. So this is the area the Ayyubids are controlling, which is much of the same area that the Fatimids had. All right, and again, they kind of would butt up against. They kind of came to power when the Seljuks kind of lost control. All right, so they become the kind of the dominant, and they still recognize the Abbasid Caliphate as the kind of religious kind of de facto leader of the Islamic world. This is a statue of Saladin in Damascus. Cairo and Damascus were the two capitals of the Ayyubid dynasty. On the back here is a crusader, a French knight by the name of Renan Chatillon. He was part of a group called the Knights Templar, who we'll talk in more detail. This statue is kind of an insult to Renan Chatillon. He killed Saladin's sister. All right, and Saladin in turn had him killed after the Battle of Hattin. All right, which plays a big role in that movie if we would have watched it. All right, and so the Ayyubids and the Abbasids are essentially kind of in conjunction with one another until 1258. 1258, that's when the Mongols show up. Whenever the Mongols show up, it's usually not a good thing for people. All right, we'll talk about the Mongols in great detail in chapter 8. Mongols, obviously, empire established by Genghis Khan. One of his grandsons, Hulagu, essentially basically kind of ransacks the Middle East in the 13th century. A famous siege of Baghdad basically wipes out almost the entire population. According to some historians, about 1 million people were killed in the siege. All right, those numbers are probably somewhat exaggerated, but it takes about 70 years for the city to gain its kind of pre-Mongol kind of population. Stories was that Hulagu offered the Abbasid Caliph to surrender. When he said no, he sieged the city, captured the caliph, wrapped him in a Persian rug, and had horses trample over him. Because there was a Mongol kind of tradition: you don't kill kings or emperors or something like that. You don't let their blood hit the soil. That's bad luck. All right. And so what ends up happening is that the kind of center of the Islamic world moves away from Baghdad to Cairo, basically at this point. This here is an image of Hulagu with his wife, who was an historian Christian. All right. And the Mongols have a mix of various religions. Now, after Hulagu dies, the number of Mongols stay in Persia in this area, and they form what they call the Ilkhanate. Right, almost all the kind of descendants of Hulagu converted to Islam. So this guy who's responsible for the death of probably 1 million or so Muslims, his descendants after him are going to be convert to the religion. This is a medieval manuscript showing the siege of Baghdad, one of the more famous sieges in world history. Now, the Mongols were halted as they made their way through the Middle East by a group called the Mamluks. All right. Now, the Mamluks kind of served within the Ayyubid dynasty and the Abbasid Caliphate there. They were what we call they were referred to as slaves, but they're more mercenaries. They're essentially not owned by an individual, but owned by the state. All right. And they were the ones who essentially basically pushed the Mongols back. And as a result, they filled that vacuum that was left by the Ayyubids. All right. So they halted Mongol advancement. They maintained a kind of a presence in mainly Egypt until the Ottoman Empire shows up, all right, in the 15th century. All right, and then they stayed on. The Ottomans would use them as same thing as kind of like mercenaries. The British used them the same. All right, and so this is here is essentially the area that they're kind of controlling. They were Sunnis. They consider themselves kind of an extension of the Abbasid Caliphate, even though the Abbasid Caliphate after 1258 was gone. All right, and then this is an image of a kind of a Mamluk from the 1700s. They're kind of famous for their kind of fez type caps there, right? And they're kind of like specially kind of shaped swords. So that's the kind of political and kind of like situation that goes on in the Islamic world up till about like the 13th century, 14th century. All right. Now, culturally speaking, like you're kind of getting back to kind of the Abbasids here, the kind of like the Islamic golden age. Like we're talking about like this era, like during like the 800s, 900s and stuff like that. This is the more advanced part of the world. Western Europe was kind of going through the dark ages. Europeans were taking steps backwards. This was the more advanced part of the world. Here and then East Asia. You had population centers that were basically in the hundreds of thousands that were also a mix of various cultures, very similar to what we talked about in Greece with Hellenism after the Greeks made a presence in like kind of parts of the Middle East and Persia and stuff. All right. One example of these kind of like large kind of urban centers is in Spain, Cordoba. All right, which served as the capital of Moorish Spain, which was a connection of the Umayyad dynasty, until about the 1200s. Cordoba had a population at its height at one point about 500,000. Right. The only other city in Europe that had a larger population at that time was Constantinople. Right. And so Cordoba was the center in Islamic Spain of various mix of kind of like Muslim, but also Christian and Jewish populations and such. It was also a place of intellectual endeavors and things of that nature. So I'm going to play this short little video here from that series, Mankind, Story of All of Us, all right, with Josh Brolin, who played Thanos in the Avengers, kind of talking about the importance of Cordoba. But now the first minute here talks about kind of the expansion out of Arabia. What I failed to mention is that much of the kind of expansion between 632 and 732 was funded by a gold rush that was found in Arabia. All right, because to garner a sizable military takes some money, if you will. So I failed to mention that to you guys yesterday, or Friday, I should say.
A gold rush sparks a boom in trade and a new chapter for mankind. From the trading center of Mecca, a charismatic leader emerges, the Prophet Muhammad, and a new religion. In 20 years, Islam unites the warring tribes of Arabia.
It was the particular genius of the burgeoning Islamic State to use that gold to fund a massive army that was able to push beyond the Arabian Peninsula to create a new kind of empire, a distinctly Islamic empire.
From Mecca, in modern-day Saudi Arabia, Islam spreads across North Africa and into Europe, dominating lands once controlled by the Romans. A new civilization reaches into Spain and builds a new city. Cordoba. Home to a remarkable inventor, Abbas ibn Firnas, astronomer, engineer, inventor. He's invented a water clock, a planetarium, a magnifying glass. Now he'll risk his life for a new invention. 1,000 years before the Wright brothers, he wants to fly. An extraordinary experiment in an extraordinary city. Cordoba is home to 500,000 Muslims, Christians, and Jews. In Europe's dark ages, a beacon of tolerance and learning. 37 libraries, the knowledge of mankind, much of it rescued from ancient Greece and Rome.
What one wonders about is if Islamic scientists had not played this role of nursemaid to science, how would we have gotten here? Because in the West, we had lost that with our dark ages. How would science have survived in the West if it had not been for the Islamic scholars?
Arabs take a great leap forward in astronomy, engineering, medicine. They create algebra and simplify math. With the numbers 0 to 9, still known as Arabic numerals. Ibn Firnas is fascinated by the laws of flight and has built his own flying machine.
What an extraordinary thing to try to do. This crazy guy was willing to jump off a building to improve the state of human knowledge.
By guiding these wings up and down, I will fly. If all goes well, after soaring for a time, I will return safely.
Accounts of the time report.
He attached a couple of wings to his body, and from a great height flung himself into the air. He flew a considerable distance, as if he had been a bird.
But without a tail, he can't control his descent. He'll suffer back pain for the rest of his life, but he enters the historical records, the first human to fly.
This willingness to risk life and limb for knowledge is one of the things that has really brought humans to where we are today.
Right, so, and there's Ibn Farnes's kind of all over the Islamic world there, and we'll talk about some specific ones tomorrow, all right? But also, too, in these kind of urban centers here, much like we talked about with Greece and Rome, you have like kind of like, you know, the Agora in Greece and kind of like the marketplace, the forum and such in Rome. You have these areas where people can exchange goods and ideas and stuff like that. And commerce plays a big role in Islam. Like there's a number of kind of surahs that mention like how you're supposed to basically treat people when you trade with fairly. And the Prophet had a reputation when he was a merchant as being somebody who was fair and stuff like that. So in a lot of these places, like these sizable kind of urban centers like Cordoba and Baghdad and Cairo and that, you have these kind of marketplaces, which still exist in these kind of like cities as well, called bazaars. All right, and so a bazaar is like a kind of a covered market area. When I was in Morocco, they refer in this place called Suez, so they refer to it as the Medina, which simply just means city. So the largest bazaar in the world is actually classified as in Istanbul. All right, and again, you can find it's like a mall type thing, all right, type situation. All right, but it, you know, again, commerce plays a big role in the kind of like the social fabric of these kind of places, just like any type of city. All right, and then also too, there's something that we get from kind of the Islamic world, where like particularly for those who are traveling with portable wealth, you know, gold, silver, or whatever like that, it can be kind of dangerous if you're going long distances here. So a number of like kind of they would establish these kind of they establish like kind of like relationships with merchants and stuff like that, and so instead of carrying a whole bunch of wealth, you would have, like in certain cases, a kind of IOU that would emerge here. All right, and so they would refer to as SOC, which was like kind of a line of credit that was usually kind of a certificate or whatever that was like kind of handwritten. All right, as this concept makes its way to the West, we get the word check and CHEQUE in French, check, which becomes our word for check now. All right, now probably today you guys probably don't write a lot of checks. So everything's probably like done like electronically, if you will. But the next time you write a check, just like kind of think about that. It has its actual origins in the Islamic world from kind of long distance trading, if you will. And then also a lot of these city centers, these city places would have, like you said, Cordoba had like 37 libraries. All right, they would have these places that would be like kind of places where you had think tanks and stuff like that. Probably the most famous example during the kind of the golden age, the peak there in Baghdad was the House of Wisdom, which was kind of like the Library of Alexandria was during the age of Hellenism. All right. Like the video said there, a lot of these kind of like libraries in the Islamic world maintain manuscripts that date back to the Greeks. If it wasn't for Muslim scholars in places like the House of Wisdom or in Toledo or Cordoba or whatever, we would not have the Renaissance. All right, because like while like Muslim scholars were translating kind of Plato and Aristotle into Arabic, in Western Europe, basically people were kind of going backwards. All right. So unfortunately, the House of Wisdom, though, was burnt to the ground when the Mongols came through. But luckily, other places kind of hand copy these manuscripts, and they would have these places, and they would have libraries that would kind of stretch. We'll talk about like Mali in West Africa had a library that had a number of kind of manuscripts, you know. And so this is like kind of like essentially kind of like a golden age of kind of intellectual endeavor. All right. Also in the Middle East, and even you would see like kind of like almost universities developing. Some maybe 300-400 years before they would emerge during the High Middle Ages in Europe. Right. The Arabic term for an educational institution is called a madrasa. Now, initially, madrasas were places of essentially just like kind of religious as well as secular studies, things like math, science, astronomy, and that. Today, it tends to be a little bit more narrow in its definition. Tends to be more religious, and unfortunately, a lot of times they get like kind of a reputation of being very rigid in their interpretation of the Quran. Like kind of like famously the Taliban, who were in control in Afghanistan until 2001. They had their origins in a madrasa in Pakistan. All right, so a lot of their rigid interpretations and stuff like that was kind of laid out there. But we see this kind of tradition predate what's going on with our first university in Italy, in Bologna, in like basically the 12th century. And then we also see the kind of like what they would classify as chemistry labs. Probably the first chemistry labs were in the Islamic world, in Persia and Baghdad, places like that. Now, chemistry, and like some of these guys are dealing with what we would classify as the scientific method before it was even given a name. Essentially, kind of they come out of this kind of faux science called alchemy, right? The idea of trying to make gold out of ordinary metals. But it's a process that was kind of important. So what you would do is you take compounds, you separate them and sometimes diluting them, right? Kind of liquidizing. The Arabic word for that is alcohol, where we get the word alcohol from. All right. And so you see an alchemist, you see the word chemist right in there. All right. So it's not necessarily the finished product, it's basically the kind of like what goes into that and basically the kind of the steps. All right. So tomorrow I'll talk about like various like individuals that make contributions to mathematics, to science, things like that. All right, and we'll finish up the chapter tomorrow. Did you guys get that? I was kind of moving fast. Anybody miss one? Fall asleep? No? Okay. All right, see you guys tomorrow. We'll finish up the chapter.